mon nom est Mathieu Dupuis. Je m'appelle Mathieu Dupuis. My name is Mathieu Dupuis. I'm a professor at Téluq in Montreal in labor relations. So I'm going to chair this fantastic session called Internal Union Affairs. We have 4 papers. Chloé Fortin va commencer de l'UQTR. Then it's Tingting, Zhang, and I think you're presenting on the behalf of your co-authors that are Lorenzo, Frangi, and Sinisa Hadziabdic. Sorry for the pronunciation. Then we will have Cole Eisen for U of T, and then to finish, Chris Smith and Leda Duxbury, both from Carleton University. So for paper, 15 minutes each, 15 minutes chaque. Then 30 minutes of question. So I'm gonna let Chloé va présenter en français, but she has slides in English. So 15 minutes, I'll give you a hand, or after 15 minutes, I'll just tell you to hurry or stop. À toi, Chloé. Merci. Mon micro est fermé, par contre. Ouais.
OK. Tout le monde m'entend? Everyone? It's okay? So you can see my slides? Oui, OK. Thank you. Merci à ILERA pour cette occasion de présenter ce papier. As Mathieu told you, my presentation will be in French, but the slides are in English, and be free to ask me any question at the end in English or in French. I will try to answer that to answer them as I can. So this is really a research project which is at its initial stage, I will say. Donc, c'est l'étude des dynamiques de partage du leadership au sein des équipes syndicales locales, État des lieux et pistes de recherche, the study of shared leadership dynamics with local union teams, existing literature and research avenue. Donc, c'est vraiment la phase initiale d'un projet de recherche qui vient tout juste d'être subventionné par le Fonds de recherche du Québec, Société et Culture pour 20 à 23. Dans le cadre de la relève professorale. Donc, en fait, pour mettre un peu dans le contexte de cette recherche-là, en fait, ça se situe vraiment dans une idée où est-ce qu'il y a un contexte marqué par une fragilisation du rapport salarié-syndicat. Il y a plusieurs auteurs dans ce contexte-là qui ont fait valoir que le renouvellement de la capacité représentative des syndicats prend racine dans les pratiques locales et plus particulièrement dans les capacités et le leadership qui est développé par les équipes de représentants syndicaux locaux. Il y a quelques études qui ont porté sur l'exercice, donc les comportements de leadership des représentants syndicaux locaux, et ils se sont essentiellement intéressés aux effets des comportements individuels, au leadership vertical. Pourtant, il y a des études récentes qui avancent que le leadership local, il ne peut pas s'expliquer uniquement par des comportements individuels, mais qui s'insère aussi dans un processus collectif qui se traduit notamment par la capacité des équipes syndicales à se partager les rôles et à collaborer. Donc, cette recherche vise essentiellement à mieux comprendre la dimension collective du leadership syndical local et à ses impacts auprès des membres, et ce, à travers l'analyse d'un cadre novateur et original. Au niveau de la littérature sur les comportements de leadership des représentants syndicaux, il y a plusieurs travaux qui ont cherché plus généralement à identifier des stratégies, des pistes d'action qui sont susceptibles de venir renforcer le sentiment d'appartenance et la mobilisation des membres. Ces travaux-là ont d'ailleurs contribué et s'insèrent dans une vaste littérature qu'on connaît tous très bien sur la littérature du renouveau syndical. À cet égard, il y a une série de travaux à laquelle j'ai contribué dans le cadre de ma thèse notamment, qui ont cherché à modéliser les effets des comportements individuels de leadership chez les représentants syndicaux locaux. Plus spécifiquement, l'utilisation de modèles traditionnels qui étaient éprouvés dans la littérature managériale et qui sont centrés sur le leadership vertical, notamment on peut penser au leadership transformationnel, authentique, qui ont permis de mieux comprendre les effets de certains comportements de leadership chez ces représentants-là sur l'engagement et la participation des membres. Ces études ont permis de fournir des preuves empiriques quant à l'importance de s'intéresser à l'exercice du leadership syndical local. Toutefois, comme je vous l'ai mentionné plus tôt, il y a des études récentes qui mettent en évidence les limites de ces modèles où l'exercice du leadership est assumé par un seul individu, et ce, en identifiant une composante collective au leadership syndical local. Il y a toute une, en fait, il y a des travaux récents qui ont mis en lumière ou qui ont, disons, critiqué un peu cette prédominance des modèles de leadership vertical. Donc, il y a de plus en plus d'auteurs qui questionnent la prédominance de ces modèles-là traditionnels où le leadership est assumé par un seul individu qui serait dans le contexte de gestion, le gestionnaire, qui serait par exemple dans le contexte syndical, le président de syndicat, par exemple. Cette remise en question a favorisé l'émergence dans la littérature managériale d'un nouveau modèle de leadership qu'on appelle le leadership partagé et qu'on définit comme un processus collectif par lequel les membres vont se distribuer et se répartir les rôles de leadership au sein d'un groupe. Les dernières études sur le leadership tendent d'ailleurs à démontrer que l'efficacité et la performance d'un groupe repose à la fois non seulement sur des comportements individuels, mais aussi sur des comportements collectifs de ces membres de ce groupe-là. Mais on a aussi démontré que le leadership partagé avait sa place dans différents types d'organisations, que ce soit dans des milieux manufacturiers, culturels, dans le secteur public, dans des organisations à but non lucratif, puis qui en fait engendrent des effets positifs sur les individus et les groupes. Donc, bien qu'on ait démontré l'intérêt de s'intéresser au leadership partagé, et que même ça pourrait, en fait, ça apparaît particulièrement pertinent et cohérent avec le mode de fonctionnement qui est fortement démocratique des équipes de représentants syndicaux locaux, il n'y a aucune étude empirique qui a encore permis de démontrer son efficacité en milieu syndical. Comment on peut, en fait, pourquoi le leadership partagé pourrait être intéressant dans le milieu syndical? En fait, donc, l'approche du leadership partagé, c'est particulièrement pertinent au mode de fonctionnement, comme je vous disais, mais ça peut aussi répondre, à mon avis, à plusieurs défis auxquels les équipes syndicales locales sont présentement confrontées. On pense par exemple au travail qui se complexifie ou qui demande aussi des expertises à développer chez les représentants syndicaux locaux. Ça se veut donc plus diversifier ces expertises-là, mais aussi plus spécifiques. Les équipes syndicales locales ont donc, à mon avis, un avantage à développer ce leadership collaboratif-là et distribué. Je suis également d'avis qu'en rehaussant la qualité des interactions et en facilitant l'échange d'informations entre les représentants, le partage du leadership peut générer une forte vitalité délibérative, un brassage d'idées qui peut amener les équipes syndicales à sortir des sentiers battus pour développer puis renforcer leur capacité représentative au plan local et par ricochet, favoriser l'engagement et la participation des membres. Donc, ce projet de recherche va poursuivre deux principaux objectifs de recherche. Dans un premier temps, c'est d'analyser le partage de leadership au sein des équipes syndicales locales et son impact sur l'engagement et la participation des membres syndiqués. Comme je vous l'ai dit plus tôt, la présence ainsi que l'efficacité de ce type de leadership en milieu syndical reste à démontrer. Mais aussi, cet objectif-là sous-entend un autre objectif parce que jusqu'à maintenant, les études sur le leadership partagé ont surtout cherché à analyser ses impacts sur l'efficacité et la performance de l'équipe en tant que telle qui partage ce leadership-là. Toutefois, les effets sur les membres dont les équipes assurent le leadership demeurent encore peu documentés. Donc, ce qu'on propose dans ce projet, c'est de mesurer l'amplitude du leadership partagé au sein des équipes syndicales locales, mais aussi d'élargir l'étude de ses impacts à l'engagement et la participation des membres qui sont représentés par ces équipes de représentants. Le deuxième objectif cherche à identifier les principaux modes de partage du leadership au sein des équipes syndicales locales. La mesure du leadership partagé, qui est la plus couramment utilisée, consiste à demander à chacun des membres, en fait, d'évaluer les comportements de leadership qui sont adoptés collectivement par le groupe. Cette approche nous renseigne sur l'amplitude du leadership partagé au sein du groupe, mais elle fournit très peu d'informations sur la genèse ou les modes de distribution de ce processus collectif d'influence. On peut donc se poser les questions suivantes. Comment, en dehors de leurs fonctions entrées, les représentants répartissent-ils de manière formelle et informelle le leadership au sein de leurs exécutifs? Comment se développe et se réalise concrètement le partage du leadership au quotidien dans ces équipes? Pour répondre à ces deux objectifs, j'ai deux démarches méthodologiques que je propose. Au niveau du contexte de l'étude, ce qui était initialement proposé, c'était le secteur de la santé. Là, bien sûr, on a plusieurs, avec le contexte actuel, il va falloir qu'on voit comment je peux adapter s'il y a de l'ouverture. Mais pourquoi je m'étais concentrée sur le secteur de la santé, c'est parce qu'au cours des dernières années, le réseau de la santé et des services sociaux a connu deux grandes réformes qui ont grandement affecté les structures et la marge de manœuvre des syndicats locaux œuvrant dans ce secteur. En effet, il y a la loi concernant les unités de négociation dans le secteur des affaires sociales et modifiant la loi sur les régimes de négociation dans le secteur public et parapublic, et plus récemment la réforme de 2015, ont venu limiter les unités d'accréditation par établissement puis ont décentralisé en partie les négociations collectives au niveau local. La fusion imposée des unités d'accréditation a ainsi forcé les organisations syndicales à restructurer leurs équipes locales. Cette nouvelle réalité apporte des défis en termes de collaboration et de partage de leadership local au sein des nouvelles équipes. La décentralisation de la négociation est aussi venue accorder un rôle plus central aux capacités et au leadership développés par les équipes locales. En effet, ces équipes sont maintenant appelées à négocier des matières qui sont plus complexes et qui touchent à l'organisation du travail, des enjeux qui sont majeurs pour ce secteur. Au niveau de la méthodologie, donc pour répondre aux deux objectifs, comme je vous disais, deux méthodologies. Dans un premier temps, afin de répondre au premier objectif, il y a deux questionnaires qui vont être développés. Le premier questionnaire sera distribué à l'ensemble des représentants des représentants syndicaux locaux qui œuvrent dans les comités exécutifs. Et ce, afin de mesurer le partage du leadership. Un deuxième questionnaire va être distribué à l'ensemble des membres des syndicats locaux sondés, qui va mesurer leur niveau d'engagement syndical et leur participation à la vie syndicale. Des analyses d'équations structurelles multiniveaux avec M+, qui vont être ensuite utilisées afin de tester les liens entre ces variables. Dans un deuxième temps, ce que je propose, c'est, pour répondre au deuxième objectif de ce projet, c'est en fait de réaliser des entretiens semi-dirigés avec des représentants syndicaux locaux, membres d'exécutifs locaux. Cette démarche va me permettre en fait de mieux appréhender les différents modes de partage du leadership et leurs trajectoires respectives. Elle va aussi me permettre de reconstituer le processus par lequel les représentants locaux en viennent à distribuer les rôles de leadership, ainsi que les facteurs, mais aussi les pratiques qui peuvent être favorables à l'émergence d'un tel mode de fonctionnement. Donc, je vais remplir le temps amplement. Ce que ce projet vise, il vise deux principales contributions. Dans un premier temps, ce qu'il vise, c'est à approfondir notre compréhension du leadership syndical local au-delà des effets qui ont été démontrés des comportements individuels. On dénombre quand même encore très peu d'études qui ont cherché à comprendre l'exercice de ce leadership et ses dynamiques au plan local. Un déficit analytique qui contraste fortement avec l'abondante littérature sur le leadership des gestionnaires. Sur le plan pratique, ce projet va répondre à un besoin important des organisations syndicales de développer le leadership de leurs équipes de représentants locaux. En effet, contrairement aux organisations qui investissent des sommes importantes dans le développement de leurs leaders, les organisations syndicales sont moins bien outillées et disposent parfois de beaucoup moins de moyens. Les connaissances produites par ce projet seront donc, à mon avis, fort utiles pour les organisations syndicales en apportant des pistes d'action concrètes pour les équipes de représentants syndicaux locaux qui, bien contrairement au cadre et aux gestionnaires, sont élus par leurs collègues et ont généralement reçu peu de formation ou de soutien en matière de leadership ou de gestion participative. Donc, c'est ce qui conclut cette phase initiale de réflexion sur le projet, sur le leadership partagé. N'hésitez pas si vous avez, je vous remercie pour votre écoute et n'hésitez pas si vous avez des questions ou des commentaires. Merci.
Ok, merci Chloé. 13 minutes, ça va donner plus de
Parfait, hein?
questions. Parfait, parfait. So, I'm gonna let Tingting Zhang present her paper. So, 15 minutes. I'm starting it right now.
Thank you, Matthew. And yeah, you have to cut me off because I tend to kind of speak over time. Can you guys see me? See my slides okay? Yeah. Okay. So thank you for the opportunity to present this research. This project is a working in progress. So if you have any feedback and comment, that will be greatly appreciated. And I want to start by talking about union merger. This is a very important kind of event in labor movement with significant implications. Back to 1979, Weber mentioned this: changes in the American labor movement are usually glacial in nature, but the trend of mergers may give early warnings of prospective uphills or subsidence. So this does not this phenomena does not only apply in American specifically, and also we see this in Canada, in UK, and in other kind of Anglophone countries with similar kind of labor industrial relations structure. A lot of study has been researched and examining this phenomena in terms of union merger, but what we see is this three fundamental questions has been kind of investigated so far. The first one is, how do unions merge, right? The process, what's the rationale, how do they kind of come back together? And there's a little kind of a small sliver of this kind of line of research to talk about why do union merge, right? The rationale and what's the kind of external factor, internal factor that caused the union to merge. And the majority of the study actually so far that paid attention to how do union merge. And then this kind of how do union mergers affect the members, officers, and the staff, and then the union as an institution and the labor movement. So this is really about the impact analysis. What we kind of argue that so far the literature view union merger as an event, not as a process. So there's a lack of longitudinal kind of aspect in terms of how we understand this phenomenon, which is an important part and has huge implication in terms of the whole labor movement. So we kind of take a step back and seeing that what about other fields? How do we kind of can borrow some kind of research from other different fields and to help us to understand this process? What we kind of started is really there's a extensive literature in management talk about merger and acquisition, right? In the field of strategy, organizational theory, and organizational behavior. And in particular, those fields, they recognize the importance of individual and organization alignment in this process of merger and acquisition. Okay, so this majority of them focus on private sector. Some talk about nonprofit public sector as well. But I think overwhelmingly majority of the research so far has been talking about, if the members do not understand or do not buy in the whole merger acquisition ideas, that most likely it will lead to the failure of the, merger. So that's kind of the starting point of where we get started. And because they talk about the process, they try to understand the alignment. So a majority of the part, they kind of try to explain the reason that why there's a lack of individual and organizational alignment is this kind of the identity work that being processed in this process, right? When you merge two kind of separate organizations together, there's a change and shift in terms of identity, and people somehow feel that their old organizational identity being attacked or under threat, so they kind of have this reactions. Sometimes it triggers identity work, so they try to realign and reposition their own organizational identity, and sometimes it doesn't really work. So overall, this is kind of the underlying mechanism to explain why mergers do not really work in the private sectors, in those business settings. And those researchers further try to make a kind of an argument saying that, hey, sense making and sense giving that's the kind of like, way we can address this misalignment between individual and organization, especially in the merger setting. And talk about sense making and sense giving, like individuals within the organization needs to have this kind of a new sense that being processed along the identity work, and from the organizational perspective and the leadership need to give the sense. So that's the sense giving piece. So in this process, like many start talking about, hey, communication is the key, right? Like, leaders need to explain their rationale for merger, their understanding about their vision of the new organization to be able to see this is who will we become. And that really kind of bring in the piece that, how do we make sure the membership is buying? Okay, so management folks, they study a lot about this. And when we kind of look back about like industrial relation folks, and we find there's a perfect alignment in terms of how we can bridge these two lines of literature together and start study the union merger. And we also feel that the union provide a really unique settings to evaluate all those management literature and research at this point, right? Because like when you look at the private sector business mergers, we have decision made at the top, and then folks, have to absorb all those information in this process. If they, agree, they can just continue as business as usual. If they don't agree, they could either suck it up or they quit the job, right? There's no kind of feedback, mechanism to see, hey, I don't really get what you try to do, right? From the individual or employee's perspective. But in the union settings, we have the perfect democratic mechanism. If the merger being proposed by the leadership and then the members do not agree, they can vote the proposal out, right? So this gives us a kind of like a further reinforcement to see, hey, if we study this process, we can actually confirm what's going on at the bottom, right? Like, is this really the sense-making, sense-giving process being understood at the bottom? So we use this particular specific Canadian case that happened like, most recently, which is a merger between these two prominent unions in Canada, and they joined forces and they formed the largest private sector unions in Canada right now, the Unifor. And the intention was announced around February 2012, and in May 2013, the union was established as a national convention, and then first established publicly, and then August 2013, they have the first national convention, and they have been growing significantly over time. So in this particular project that I try to present, I try to answer the 3 questions. Do labor unions experience identity change before, during, and after merger? So this is a process, a kind of perspective we try to understand. Do union locals react to the identity shift? And how do the internal and external communication unfold the sense-giving and sense-making process? Like I said, it's a kind of working in progress, so I will demonstrate some preliminary results, and then we can have a discussion. So in terms of research methods, like, today I present this part that we use topic modeling and sentiment analysis to really understand the discussion that happened, around this event. And for today's presentation, I'm only going to present the external discussion, which we collect the information from the Twitter. Okay, so I collect the 2 organizations before merger, the CEW, CEP, and then we also collect the kind of post-merger discussion on Twitter as well. So here you can see that we collect about 3,100 tweets from CEW, about 900 tweets and retweets. Okay, so that's the part. Tweets and retweets from CEP before the merger. That's like before 20. If you see the red line on the slide, that's the May 2030 kind of like the establishment on announcement of the new union. And Unifor, it up to the end of 2017, early 2018, we have 11,700-ish kind of tweets that being collected. If you look at the kind of like the picture here, you can see that CW was engaged in the Twitter discussion a lot earlier. Like they started to establish their account in 2009, and then they kind of gradually increased their presence. CEP they registered their account in 2012, and then of course, like, you know, during this about, I would say 12, 13 months period, they also tweeted some content. And of course, Unifor used a lot, like they engaged in intensive kind of discussion online. We argue that this is a really good kind of like point to examine their communication and their sense-making process, because, you know, they try to engage both their members in the virtual world and the external kind of constituents, people who really kind of follow the process, they really want to hear from the union. So we call them sympathizers. So you gotta, like, you know, when you create a new kind of like, you know, organization, you gotta legitimize yourself to those folks, to the general public as well. So the information they talked about, they tweeted around and on social media has kind of profound implications to their sense-making and decision-making process. So, like I said, we use topic modeling, and we examine, like, you know, what kind of like the most predominant information they discussed on Twitter field. So here you see the topics on this slide and displayed over time, and also the size of the bubbles represent the frequencies that they talk about those information. So, like I said, CEW, they started using Twitter a lot earlier than CEP. So their early discussion focused very heavily on their identity. We are the auto workers. CEW is the union representing auto workers. They also talk a lot about their labor actions, like, you know, strike actions, collective bargaining process, the outcome, and also a small slip kind of percentage about their kind of activities that socialize within members. And they also heavily engaged in the political discussions. So, like, you know, how do we help migrant workers? How do we, you know, respond to the trade deals, stuff like that. And after February 12, when they start announcing the kind of like, you know, the merger intent publicly, they start talking about this new union. This is what we define as a transitional identity for both unions. Even though there's two unions, but they have a very different kind of approach in terms of how they organize and bargain. So at the bottom, you see that around 2012, CEP also have their own Twitter account. They also kind of emphasize heavily about the unions, but they also engage a small kind of like position about their, you know, who we are as a CEP, and their political discussion is more kind of like in terms of general social justice that kind of like further away from like the membership kind of like, you know, focus. And 2013 is kind of the year of the merger, and we can see that they still continue to talk about this transition identity, the new unions, but they start kind of pumping up this huge sense-giving process about promoting Unifor, who we are as a Unifor, right? Because the name is become more generalized, and it's kind of hard for members and the public to understand who they are. So they kind of put a lot of efforts talking about who we are as a union to be able to build the legitimacy. And CEP continue their kind of like a Twitter discussion a little bit, but most of them, they start talking about, you know, the collective bargaining process that, you know, kind of like happened in the process. And over time, we can see that up to 2015 and all the way to 2017, like the identity building process kind of like, you know, really grinded into a certain point, and then all the discussions start moving to like, you know, the political related, the policy related discussion, and especially in 2013, there's a kind of like a discussion about, you know, how do we build our coalition. And when we start looking at the locals, we picked, we picked the 3 or 4 union locals at this point, and we analyze their information as well. And we see there's still kind of a transition, but like a lot of discussion you see here, like mostly kind of is the trickle down information from the national. So it's like a pass over by the local unions in terms of message and the content they discuss. And I also want to kind of like point a little bit at the result that we got for the sentiment analysis. Okay, so we pulled all the Twitter messages of those accounts, and we analyze how like the percentage of of positive information or positive words versus negative sentiment, negative words being used. So this is the kind of common analysis in kind of social media communication is because we know our social media negative sentiment message being trickled down and much further and much faster than the positive information. But from the organizational perspective, you know, you need to mobilize your members or consolidate your members using more positive information to strengthen the labor movement. So what we see is that percentage-wise, CEW has much more positive information compared to the CEP, and over time it grows for the uniform as well.
If you could wrap up in 30
Yes.
seconds to 1 minute.
The 30 second is that we find some interesting stuff, the identity works, the information communication being used by the uniform social media, and there's a difference. And locals mostly likely pick up the information from the national. But I think there will be interesting kind of discussion, and I hope like you guys can comment on what can I go next in terms like, you know, interesting question you want to address based on the information and data we have. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tingting, for your presentation. So we're gonna go directly to the third paper. So call Eisen from U of T.
Yep, I'm just gonna share my PowerPoint here.
Yeah.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah, so you have 50 minutes.
Let me see, okay. All right, so hello everybody. Today I'm going to be presenting my paper, and this is a condensed version of that paper, The Law of Internal Union Affairs. It's called The Dual Aspect of Canadian Unions, Public and Private Law Issues in the Context of Internal Trade Union Disputes. And what I'm going to try to do over the next 10 or 15 minutes is to map the boundary between the law of collective bargaining in Canada and the law of internal union affairs as it exists at least in common law Canada. And that's the law governing everything we've been talking about so far, dealing with relations between union members and the union. So union elections, mergers, but also asset ownership, matters of internal discipline, local union relations with the parent union, and then processes of disaffiliation. My paper is a legal paper, so it goes into a lot of the case law, but I think it's best to give you the broad strokes. And then at the end, if we have time, we can look at a relatively high profile case, actually dealing with Unifor, which came before the Ontario Court of Appeal last year in the context of a raiding attempt. You'll note that I make reference to the Ontario case law and legislation, but the general picture I'm painting applies throughout English Canada. It applies in the federal sector, and I understand that it's mirrored in Quebec in the Civil Code. Specifically, there's two things I'd like to accomplish today. And that's to shed light on what remains a pretty murky area of Canadian labor law. I'm going to suggest to you that there's a dual public-private aspect to Canadian trade unions as they exist within the legal system. And second, I'm going to argue that the application of private law doctrines to the public face of Canadian unions, that is the face engaged by collective bargaining legislation, that risks undermining the integrity of our industrial relations system as a whole. Our starting point is this. Labor law in Canada, that is the law applying to unionized workers, can be divided into two parts. There's the modern statutory law of collective bargaining, the Wagner Act, and then there's this residual jurisdiction called the common law of internal union affairs. As my diagram attempts to reflect, most of our attention goes to the former category, here the larger box, and that makes sense. Our modern law of collective bargaining gives workers statutory rights in exchange for certain restrictions on conduct that would otherwise disrupt economic activity, and namely we're talking about striking. These sets of labor rights impose correlative duties on employers, and they completely eclipse the common law of master-servant relations which governed work up into the 20th century. In addition to replacing the body of law that applied, we know that these statutes also removed common law judges from the labor law jurisdiction and replaced them with labor boards and arbitrators. So this process of repudiation and replacement has been almost total. All of our Canadian jurisdictions have adopted a version of the American Wagner Act to govern relations between the employer and the union. However, there are almost no internal governance rules like those imposed by the Taft-Hartley amendments in the United States. So unlike the United States and unlike Great Britain, internal union affairs in Canada continue to be governed as they always were. And in English Canada, that's at common law. This means that we have two sets of labor laws in Canada: our statutory law of collective bargaining managed by specialized tribunals, and then this old law of internal union affairs to govern, mergers, discipline, disaffiliation, union elections, which all continues to be managed by judges. Now, a second point to make here is that our two regimes are mutually exclusive. This is affirmed in all the legislation, and here you see an example from Section 114 of the Ontario Labour Relations Act, but it's also reflected in the case law. And this must be the case. The two regimes must be mutually exclusive because they operate in accordance with radically different legal principles and reflect totally conflicting normative ideas about work. In particular, our law of collective bargaining operates according to the principle of exclusivity, which promotes legal solidarity and union cohesion in order to facilitate collective action. And it does so by designating the majority-backed union as the exclusive bargaining agent and barring minority unionism. This is obviously a departure from the freedom of contract, which defines the common law approach, but also, as anyone who studies industrial relations will know, it's also very different from what happens in Europe. The modern statutory regime replaces and repudiates the common law so that freedom of contract is no longer the governing principle of collective labor relations. And in its place, we put a complete statutory scheme. And as I'll suggest, this statutory scheme attempts to make unionization possible in the unique, in this case, North American legal, social, and economic context. And that's sort of what I've tried to capture here in my diagram. So within this structure, the law of internal union affairs is a residual category. It's the leftover from the common law that wasn't replaced by the Wagner Act. And it continues to reflect private law principles. Canadian trade unions within this framework then are both private independent associations organized around union constitutions, which are enforced via the private law of contract, but they're also statutorily designated bargaining agents. And sort of the key insight of my paper, the point I'm trying to drive home, is that we should really see Canadian unions as two distinct but overlapping juridical entities. And those two entities are regulated by different sets of principle. And what I'm going to put to you is that attempting to apply the wrong principles to the wrong sort of juridical entity is going to really mess with the way our industrial relations system operates. So let's start with the private law aspect of Canadian trade unions as voluntary associations. As I've mentioned, common law courts derive their jurisdiction over internal trade union affairs via the law of contract. This derivation process, as I've mentioned, also predates the modern statutory law of collective bargaining. It's a leftover from the way things were before the 1940s. And just to quote the Supreme Court of Canada here, once a member joins a union, a relationship in the nature of contract arises between the member and the trade union. It's this contract that governs elections, mergers, all the things we're talking about in this session. And so why is that? Contract law is a very useful and I would put to you the only analytical tool judges really have to enforce the union constitution. But we also have to remind ourselves that the role of contract law continues to be residual. And as this excerpt suggests, it's actually subordinate to a modern collective bargaining framework. So a clear example of what I'm talking about here would be a civil suit demanding that a union president step down after their term expires, or after they lose an election, or to enforce a distribution of assets clause when a union dissolves. In both cases, the court's going to interpret the constitution of the union and enforce its terms on the members. Now, when we compare the logic underpinning our public and private labor law regimes, we see the risk of according the private law of internal union affairs too much of a role. Internal union affairs remain tethered to a law of contract centered on the individual worker, not the collective. And they lack the tools to consider whether a decision turning on the member-union relationship enhances or hinders freedom of association in the aggregate. Approaching an issue through this contractual framing invites judicial doctrines of fairness, such as unconscionability, which ask whether a particular bargain is voluntary and in accordance with the legal principles which cause us to enforce contracts in the first place. And for those of you who haven't read the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in the Uber case from yesterday, unconscionability is just how common law courts get out of enforcing very unfair contracts. Now, surprisingly, the application of this doctrine of unconscionability, a contract law doctrine, actually does have some precedent in Canadian jurisdictions. For example, in 2008, the Ontario Court of Appeal decided in a case called Birch that provisions in the PSAC Constitution, which imposed fines on members for crossing a picket line, were unenforceable because they were unconscionable. Now, this holding turned on the court's finding that the Union Constitution was a standard form contract, which is a fancy legal term for a take it or leave it deal. Now, we should note at the outset how curious such a decision is. To anyone who knows anything about industrial relations, the fact that the same contractual terms under the Union Constitution apply to each individual member cannot be a sign of unfairness, but rather a sign that things are functioning as they should. Allowing each member to negotiate every clause of the Union Constitution independently, it just wouldn't make any sense, let alone would it be able to be reconciled with the duty of fair representation. So the point is that no matter how contextual a judge purports to be, contract law fairness analysis cannot reconcile itself to this principle of exclusivity that we use in Canada to deliver freedom of association. This is the reason common law courts were kicked out of our labor law in the 1940s. As I've already noted, the Canadian law of collective bargaining, it seeks to foster legal solidarity through this curious mechanism of exclusive representation. It's structured on the idea that if we restrict individual freedom, we can maximize and in fact instantiate freedom of association in the aggregate. And this is exactly why we have closed shop arrangements and automatic dues deductions through the RAND formula. These are the arrangements that allow the union to foster solidarity and wield economic power through internal governance structures so that they can fulfill their statutory role and counter collective action problems such as free riding. Now, you may well wonder why our regime is so restrictive. Why, for example, do we not permit minority unionism or workplace coalitions? And the answer we get in the literature is twofold. On one hand, our model benefits employers who have an easily identifiable bargaining partner, and in order to be certified, the union has to give up its right to strike for recognition and contract enforcement. And then we're also told that the diverse North American working class lacked the social solidarity workers had in Europe, so that a legal form of solidarity had to take its place. And here you see Paul Weiler talking about this as the need to weld employees into a cohesive single group so that they can present a united front to the employer and exercise sufficient countervailing power to influence the terms of their employment and avoid divide and rule tactics by the employer. Now, instead of unconscionability and other private law fairness doctrines, our collective labor law has its own proprietary tools to address claims of unfairness, and these are what we know as unfair labor practices. These are adjudicated by the Labor Board in accordance with a balancing framework, which asks whether a union's conduct is reasonable in light of the overarching policy rationales I've just mentioned. And in this way, the extent to which unions can constrain individual choice through internal control measures is a function of freedom of association itself. Now, disgruntled union members always have the option of switching bargaining agents or disaffiliating during a rating period designated under the statute. And this safety valve option ensures that some worker choice is preserved in what is otherwise a highly restrictive labor relations model. And it makes sure that it's done so in a way which is exercised in accordance with that overarching principle of majoritarian exclusivity, which I have been talking about. So the question is, what does this all mean for a worker who finds themselves unsatisfied with their union? Do they have to run for union office and organize with others? Should they switch bargaining agents during the next rating period? Or can they go to court, making an individual contract claim, arguing that the union constitution is unfair? And it was this latter course of action that was undertaken in a recent Ontario decision called Brown and Hanley. The case arose after an unsuccessful attempt by Unifor to raid the local representing employees of Toronto's Transit Commission. The ATU, which was the American-based international union holding the rights at the TTC, responded by attempting to take control of the Toronto local through a trustee process outlined in the union constitution. Now, local union officers, along with some members who supported the raid, tried to block the trusteeship process by invoking the internal union affairs jurisdiction and the law of contract. Specifically, they relied on that Birch case dealing with PSAC's picket line protections, arguing that the union constitution blocked them from exercising their right to switch unions in many ways. One of the ways was they said the local couldn't take its assets with it if it joined Unifor. So they argued that the union constitution was unenforceable as a matter of contract law because it was unconscionable. And I think this puts that two overlapping juridical entities idea to work. You have the bargaining agent designated by statute, holding bargaining rights with the employer, and then you have the private association governed by the union's constitution. Remember, the claim was that the union members' ability to switch bargaining agents, a right guaranteed by statute, was unfairly hindered by operation of the union constitution. And putting the argument this way, I would argue we see the sleight of hand, what I call a Trojan horse. The unsatisfied members were always free to disaffiliate as a matter of public law by switching bargaining agents during the designated rating period in the manner contemplated by the statute. And while the private relations embodied by the union constitution might have made switching unions costly, they did not interfere with this public law right. The provisions are not a sign of unfair bargaining, but are reflections of the ways in which unions maintain strong organizations able to effectively contest employer power. In other words, they are consistent with the Wagner Act scheme and serve the welding function Paul Weiler wrote about. So the upshot here is that the proper way to bring a claim that your union is preventing you from exercising your protected freedom to associate is not in court, but at the labor board. And that's because the labor board has exclusive jurisdiction over the compulsion and coercion alleged in Brown. Only here, in this forum, would an adjudicator be attuned to the entire statutory scheme when considering whether a particular provision of the union constitution is unfair. But by bringing the complaint forward in the court, the complainants blurred the distinction that we have drawn between the public and private faces of Canadian unions. And in doing so, they bypassed the careful balance set by the statutory scheme and invited the application of private law principles by common law judges, both of which I've explained have been banished from our law of collective bargaining. And that concludes what I have to say. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Thanks, Cole. We have a really disciplined and respectful presenters today. I guess it's a characteristic of a young scholar. I'm just, that's a joke. So our fourth and final paper will be presented by Chris Smith. So Chris, it's your turn.
Alrighty. All right, is that working for everyone? All right. Okay. Hi. Thanks for having me here. My name is Chris Smith. I'm currently in between homes. I just finished my PhD at Carleton. And I'm just about to start a job, I guess, next week at the University of New Brunswick in their business school. And this presentation I'm going to do today is, it comes from my dissertation research, but it didn't make it into the dissertation itself. And so my supervisor, Linda, and I are now kind of working through mounds of extra data that we have. So today I'm going to talk to you about a bit of that, specifically about union change readiness from an emic perspective. So a bit of context, like all organizations that exist in a dynamic environment, unions face a number of pressures for change. And this is evidenced in the research. So first on the macro level, the whole idea of union renewal is centered on change. It's reacting to the decline that unions have faced over the last 50 or 60 years, and their reaction to that and how they hope to manipulate different dimensions of their environment to improve that environment. So on a bigger level, we're looking at dealing with macro level change. But research also identifies areas of kind of more micro level where unions themselves need to change or should change to kind of bring about this union renewal. So there's research that looks at specific union processes and kind of characteristics that need to change. So there's some stuff showing that unions need to become more democratic, open up their social networks to be more inclusive of different voices that are not really heard. Research has shown how communication processes have hindered renewal, whether through lack of communication or lack of perhaps not the most efficient use of technology or the most effective use of technology, not all that sort of stuff. And then also there's been a lot of research into kind of different structures, strategies, and tactics that could use some change. So that brings us to the question then, are unions actually prepared to successfully implement the changes they need to cope with the changing world around them? So then I look to answer this question to the change management literature, specifically stuff on kind of change readiness and change resistance. Work by Jick in 1991 and the Fords 2008. They really talk about change resistance as a social phenomenon, as an environmental phenomenon, kind of moving it away from putting blame on the members of an organization themselves, saying that they're lazy or selfish or whatever, moving away from that and looking at the kind of conditions in which change takes place and to see if that's conducive to change or not. And so through this, the idea has come about that there's a variety of impediments to change that can spring up if the environment isn't right. So things like uncertainty. So if members don't understand why you're making the changes, they'd be less likely to buy into them and make it happen. Same like if they don't know how it's going to be carried out or that sort of thing, that will also be an impediment. So that was the kind of stuff that was talked. I think Tingting talked about that in her presentation a bit. The idea too, fear of loss comes about if you don't really understand what's going on. You might be worried about the power you might lose, the routine that you kind of rely on for psychological safety. That might all be out the window. So if the environment's not right to kind of help with those fears, change might not happen as well. So the literature then also says there are ways to mitigate these kind of impediments, and that's through creating an environment that is conducive to change. So that's includes a lot of communication, so people understand why changes are being made and where you're headed with the changes. Also the idea of empowering members of the organization to make them feel more like they're part of the change, so they're steering it. They're not just being, the change isn't just being forced on them, they're helping say what the change should be. And then there should be trust between the members and the people who are leading the change, whether it's people formally in the power structure or more informally, maybe in rank and file who are more emotional kind of leaders, that sort of thing. So if there's a lack of trust on those levels, then it's less likely that change will work out. So with all that said, the objective of this research here is to identify obstacles to successful change from the members' perspective. So to do this, we carried out the study with a large transportation industry union based in the US. So this is the basis of my dissertation was with this union. So we did an action research project with them. They're a large union, their members are spread out and they travel a lot. The membership is aging. I think the average age was about 52. And a lot of the people in leadership positions were on the cusp of retirement, and the union did not have the younger members who were active enough that they're afraid to basically, they're afraid that they won't have the sustainable membership to keep up the power that they need within their union. So we worked with them for over the course of about 4 years. We did 2 sets of interviews, 2 sets of surveys, and came up with a number of pilot projects that were implemented with hoping to improve basically engagement and involvement from younger members and all members, but specifically younger members. So the data I'm talking about today came from the second set of interviews, which were semi-structured interviews. We did 75 of them. And for this analysis today, I used kind of a take on Sharmaz's take of her grounded theory I guess, technique, where you break things down into larger themes and then sub-themes using the participants' words as much as is possible. So we asked members, our participants, what obstacles, if any, do you think might prevent the union from successfully implementing changes in the future? So out of this, we got 4 main themes. The first theme was that participants saw no potential obstacles. The second one was that they saw leadership as an obstacle to change. Thirdly, the communication process was getting in the way of successful change. And then lastly, membership disengagement. So the members themselves were seen as an obstacle to successful change. I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail. So no obstacles. This was the perhaps least interesting for our purposes, good for the union's purposes. So basically, people who saw no obstacles basically thought the union had the right people in charge, the right people in the right places to make change happen. So these are just some kind of typical quotes, nothing too exciting. I can't think of any reason why anything they wanted to do would fail. It's as long as it's in the reason. This top one says people see that younger people are getting more involved in the union and think that's a positive step to future change. Moving from there, though, there were a number of themes that came up that did indicate that there would potentially be some obstacles to change in the future. And a lot of these were surrounding the idea of leadership. So there's a number of sub-themes that we've identified here within leadership. So there's an old boys club, lack of appetite for change, lack of leadership skills to actually implement change, some personal motives of leadership that might be getting in the way of change, and then the political nature of leadership positions have also been seen as a roadblock to successful change. So I'll get into a bit more detail on those now. So first, the idea of the old boys club. So basically, a lot of members expressed the sentiment that there was really kind of an in-group and an out-group within the union. And if you're not in the in-group, then you don't really have much say. You're not really listened to. You're not really respected quite as much. So I'll pick the second quote here, I think is really illustrative of that. Well, it's been like this forever. Nothing's going to change. There's a few people that are buddy-buddy with the union reps, and of course, they move right up on the ladder. Everybody else, we're just out here muddling along. So again, the idea, if you're not part of the in-group, you're part of the out-group, and you don't really have much say in the way the union is steered. Next, sub-theme within the leadership theme is a lack of appetite for change. So a lot of members of our participants did kind of say that leadership just seems kind of happy as they are. They don't really want to push anything too hard. So the second quote here, I think, is illustrative of what a lot of people said. Identifying like egos and hubris perhaps as getting in the way of change. So people think that if there are changes, the vice chairman, who are kind of the liaison between the local offices and the national office, they have a lot of power and they make a lot of decisions. So they think a lot of pride is at stake here. So if changes are made, that might look bad on you if what you implemented is being changed or whatever. So that is seen as a fear for some people. Next, we have the idea of a lack of leadership skills. So members believe that the union's leaders don't have the ability to lead and to lead change. So one quote here that I think is really illustrative: "We're supposed to be brotherhood, united we stand. Well, if we're not united, we can't stand, and we need a lot more from the office in that sense," as I'm talking, like from the officers and stuff. So this guy, he figured the leadership doesn't have the capability to make everyone, to build that solidarity and get everyone moving in the same direction to move change. Others believe that some of the leadership has kind of ulterior motives. They're not necessarily in it for the union, but for themselves. There is a sentiment that there's kind of a group of union leaders who are more pro-management, and as they move up through the ranks on the job, they're friendly with management, and then the idea is that they want to get into leadership roles to kind of serve management, and they get some kind of kickback or benefit from management for doing that. One guy here straight out accuses leadership of being bought out by the union, or sorry, by the manager. Sorry, the company. Major obstacle that I can see right now is the people that are bought out by the employer. We need to get rid of them. So while that may not be true, there's at least perceptions of this happening, which seems to be a big problem. And then lastly, on the leadership topic, we have internal politics, kind of related to just the nature of being in a leadership position. So the idea that different people have different interests, so not ever, and sometimes there's so much battling over those interests that nothing really gets done, or people really dig in on their own interests and are don't want to change as a result. So the second quote here, I don't know how you shake all the politics that go along with these positions that we have, because they are elected and people tend to get protected, which seems to be, well, that's the nature of politics. The third main theme that we identified was poor communication. Or so members think that communication practices of the union are getting in the way of successful change. So first is the idea that members don't have any voice in the union. So straight out, we should have a voice, and we don't. Again, the idea that union leaders need to kind of get out of their offices, get out listening to people, and involving people in the change process. I think that would help, because the members have felt left out. Another theme within poor communication is the idea that the union is not doing a good enough job of informing members about change. So those, again, what we talked about before, the reasons for change, the plan for change, kind of how change is going, all this kind of stuff, members feel left out. Yeah, they just don't feel like they're informed in the process, and as a result, they can't buy into it. And another thing, this seemed especially true for younger workers. That came out a lot, that it was the younger guys, and we'll get to that in a second too. So the last theme that came out pretty clearly was the idea of member disengagement. So members were either apathetic towards the union or angry or dissatisfied with the union, and as a result, they were not going to buy into change. So first, this idea of apathy. People are just not really engaged in the union. And this came up a lot with the younger generation of workers, or at least they're perceived to be less engaged, thinking that they don't really understand the union, what unions stand for, what unions can bring workers, that sort of thing. So they're just lacking that type of information, so they don't buy in. They're just apathetic. They don't think the union is really worthwhile, so they just don't care. And kind of on that topic is
Chris, just
yeah,
wrap up in 30 seconds or 1 minute, please.
Yeah, for sure. This is my second last slide, I think. Okay, so the last one here is that members seem dissatisfied with the union, anger towards the union. So the idea is that they've had poor service from the union, and so they're not willing to kind of give back to it. I really like this one quote. It goes back to that whole morale thing. There's a lot of us that have kind of a shitty morale, pardon my language. Out here, we look for the best, but expect the worst. So their past dealings with the unions have put them in this state where they just expect it to be not great in the future, so they don't really try. And so to tie this all together, bringing it back to the change management change management literature, the idea of the social nature of resistance, the idea that you need to create the right environment for change to unroll smoothly. That really doesn't seem to be happening here. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of trust between the members and the leaders, that sort of thing. And then also findings, these findings reflect the union literature as well. So the idea of in-group, out-group, which leads to a lack of democracy, that came up. And then the idea of poor communication really hindering renewal and revitalization, that sort of stuff. That came through a lot too. So yeah, thanks a lot. Merci.
Thanks, Chris. We have about 24 minutes for discussion. If you, yeah, just close your, it's closed, yeah. So any question from the audience for our presenters? Jen Armour, you have a, no? No question. So I'm gonna ask question then. As a privilege of the president. Okay, so my question will lead to Tingting. Could you talk about your reflection on methods to measure merger and union identity, because it's really an unusual method to collect Twitter data. So what is your reflection of, is it a good method to really measure, and do you think you could like also complement this method with interviews? Yes. And my second question will be to Cole. Have you researched on the, so in Quebec, in the labor code for fair union representation, it's the 47.2 article, and there's a lot of studies, or at least reflection on the union side of the explosion of the use of this article to contest fair representation. So I wonder if you had a look on this this thing, because it's in Quebec, it's partly governed by the civil code, but also regime like the labor code. So what is your reflection on this? So
thanks, Mathieu. So I guess I'm gonna go jump in first. You're absolutely right. Like, we start to collect the data from Twitter, from social media, just to try to see, is there any value for social media communication? Because that has been a big question for the, I would say, the union organizers themselves as well, right? Like, the traditional union communication is like boots on the ground, knock at the door, face-to-face town hall meeting, right? So we try to see, like, is this ICT really kind of play a role, or even be a reflective in terms of what they do on ground, or their traditional communication. And on the aside, we also collect the information about their internal newsletter. That's the thing that we're in the process to decide how to analyze. Because, like, the, you know, Twitter is like 144 words, or now it's 480, right? But the article is like, you know, a couple hundred words at least. So how do we kind of like, you know, balance the proportion in terms of how do we kind of justify these two sources that we are still kind of in the process to exploring. And I 100% agree with you. I think, like, you know, the kind of the next step that we plan to take is really to figure out, like, you know, who's actually doing it by conducting interviews, reaching out to people. You know, is this really the message come from the leadership? Like, is this really a strategized, like a catered communication message delivered through the social media? Oh, this is just a random, like, you know, what we see, the 19-year communication directors randomly tweeting things, right? So that part is really kind of the next step that we try to get. But the overarching theme is that what we say is social media communication is useful, and they have been demonstrating to be a good proxy of what they have on the ground. But union has not been used social media communication effectively. But with Unifor case, they are actually doing a pretty decent job compared to the rest of the unions, I would say.
Thanks, Cole.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's a really interesting one. And I think this idea of the duty of fair representation really illustrates one of the key points I made, which is that the Wagner Act is a total scheme, and it's collectively optimizing, and it's structured on these correlative rights and duties. So when we think of the duty of fair representation, which prohibits a union from abusing its exclusive status by acting in a discriminatory manner, an arbitrary manner, or a bad faith manner, and I think that's the standard language, we think of it as a statutory duty, but it actually dates back pre-Wagner Act to a Supreme Court of the United States case called Steele and Louisville. A whites-only union secured exclusive bargaining rights for the Louisville Railway. And then they attempted to use that position to take jobs away from Black workers and take seniority away from Black workers. And the court, without any statutory authorization, recognized that the right to exclusively represent the bargaining unit generated a corresponding duty to do so in a way that was not discriminatory. And I think it's that insight which reveals to us how this structure operates, and sort of goes back to my point as to why we can't take a single duty or a single right under the Wagner Act model and focus in on it, but we have to take this broad view. Obviously, it's very hard to make out a duty of fair representation complaint, and I think a lot of union members who are unhappy with the representation they're receiving find that frustrating. Discrimination, arbitrariness, and bad faith are very high standards. But I also think this reflects that restrictive model we do have and the need for unions to be able to represent a united front and not have the employer sort of interfere in internal affairs by paying for and incentivizing members to bring forward these complaints. So I do think that that is an important aspect of what I was talking about and reflects this helicopter view I'm sort of advocating for.
Thanks. I think we have a question from Jason Foster. So Jason.
Yes, thank you to all the presenters. I think there's some really interesting commonalities across the four of the papers around sort of internal unions and barriers to change within unions. I have two questions, one to Chris and then one to Chloe. Chris, in your presentation, a lot of the sentiments that were being expressed by the members are not unusual. I mean, I think if you were to go to any union local, you would get a mixture of those kinds of views. And so I guess I'm just wondering, kind of coming out of this particular case, is if you have a sense of the dynamics over what happens to have one particular sentiment kind of take over the predominance. So if those who are skeptical and feeling a little alienated, what are the dynamics that allow that to kind of stop change versus those who have the confidence in the leadership, which would then, would foster the change? So I'm just wondering in terms of the dynamics between those different dynamics, if you could comment on that. And then to Chloe, first of all, my apologies. I'm going to ask you in English because my French is atrocious. You very much, I think, are setting up a very interesting study around shifting the way that local leaderships try and manage themselves. But I think, again, it's not uncommon to sort of see that sort of strong man leadership. It's a very male, masculine form of leadership in local unions. What do you think the barriers might be to being able to shift that culture? Because it feels like that's a fairly big culture shift in many union locals, to move away from that sense of we're going to elect this strong man and he's going to lead us into battle, to more of a collectivized sort of sort of a shared sense of leadership, which in many ways could be seen as repudiating that kind of masculine, male, gendered kind of leadership style. So I guess I'm just wondering what you think the barriers to making those kind of changes might be. Thank you.
Chris?
Okay, so that's actually a very interesting and good question, and is definitely relevant to this specific case, because both of those things were definitely going on. So there was this growing frustration, like on the lower level, that the change couldn't happen at the top level. And over the course of this, my dissertation over the project, actually, they ousted the president of the national president. And even on the more local level, there was a lot of leadership change as well. So you could see over the time of the project, I could see like the old guard that was more dug in, maybe hindering the changes that the people who wanted change from happening. But at the same time, that also seemed to spur on change because it motivated the people who were frustrated to actually kind of like more of a grassroots change. So the inertia, the official inertia, kind of led to change on the ground floor, which I guess is kind of what seems to happen and what's happening in society right now, it seems like. But yeah, there definitely were those two different kind of groups going, two different aspects going on at the same time, both independently and interacting with each other, which was really interesting to see. I don't know if I actually answered your question, but yeah.
Chloé?
Thank you for this question. It's a really interesting one. So what are the barriers to shift that culture? I think it's making a really interesting link between my presentation and the one from Chris. It's sure that we still have those kind of old boys club in unions, and I will say that that's a big barrier to this shift of culture, but I will also, maybe in a more positive way, I will probably say that to bring new generation of leaders will probably make a change in terms of culture. There's probably, I think we kind of like starting to see this changing, this new generation of leaders come to be involved in the unions. I think because there's a lot of like, it's kind of like, if you look at like the leaders, they probably now being at the end of their career a lot. So I think if we there will probably, like, new generations of leaders will probably bring this kind of shift in terms of culture, because new generation look at leadership as a more shared process, and also it could actually be also a way to maybe foster a younger people to be involved in the union, because they want to be involved in kind of a group which can represent their values and also their values in terms of leadership. So maybe it's not a really great answer I have to give you today, but I think we will probably have to wait in this shift of leadership to really see kind of a change of culture, because it's kind of like a long process. But also I think we can also argue that it could actually be a way to maybe bring younger member to be more involved in the union. So it could, I don't know if I'm right, Mathieu. Am I clear about what I'm saying?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, but I think it's a way also to maybe like foster a younger member to be more involved, like, and it could be an argument to kind of like promote this shift of culture in unions, local unions. Am I answering right to your question, Chris? Not Chris, sorry, Professor Foster, Jason Foster.
Yeah, no, I mean, it certainly was intended as an exploratory question. It certainly doesn't have easy answers. I was just curious to see what your perspective is, and so thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Tingting, you have a question?
Yeah, I think one question, one comment. The question is for Chris. Since you're looking into a U.S. case, I was wondering whether, you know, the right to work states will be different from the, you know, the non-right to work states. I'm asking this is because, you know, if we are talking about organizational kind of change literature, there's a part about, you know, words or exit. You know, I think a lot of, like, you know, your finding is that members are very unhappy about what's going on in the union. So, like, you know, when you have a option to exit, why didn't they leave the union, right? Does this change the dynamic with your, you know, your change management? And also, I want to comment on Chloe's kind of like, you know, the culture shift. I think that's super important. But like, you know, in a sense, I think there already culture shift in the healthcare sectors, especially with nurses union? Like you have a kind of a dominant share of membership is actually women, and the majority of the kind of union leaders are also women as well. So does this change like your perspective in your research? Like, I'm sorry, because like I don't understand French, so I probably missed a lot of like a key essence of your presentation. So I just kind of want to kind of point it out, you know, what exactly type of unions that you were studying in the healthcare sector, because the kind of membership composition will be different across different unions. That's just my comment. Thanks.
So with respect to the open shop, closed shop, because I don't know exactly the laws in the States, but because I think it's a federal union and it goes across different states, it was closed shop. So even if you live in a right to work state, you don't have the option of leaving. So that flattened things, made things a bit easier in that regard. But yeah, I think it sounds like a lot of people that I talked to anyway would have left if they had the option, but it was just relatively good work that was available, so they just went with it because that's what they had to do.
Chloé?
I'm sorry, Tingting. I was reading the question in the chat, so I think I missed your question. But is it like you're asking me why or which kind of occupation I will probably do my research in? Actually, I prefer not to mention right now because it's kind of an early stage, and I'm not sure, and I haven't really like start with the field work, so I'm sorry, it's not I don't want to answer to your question, but it's I made it like more general because I didn't really want to mention it for right now.
Thanks for both of you. Fair enough. But, like, we never know until we get the data, right? Sometimes like if we have the perfect design, it's just sometimes like it's not perfect process. But I'm a very forward-looking kind of like I'm interested in your research, and I look forward to read it. And so another question to Chris. I'm sorry, I just keep kind of like getting back to this whole discussion, and another aspect is this whole technology change, right? Like I had I get a fair amount of exposure with the trucking industry in the U.S. recently. They were talking about the future of work. They're talking about companies using mobile apps to train the truckers, all those things. So I was wondering, the technology change and the management control that associated with technology change, do those things have any impact to the kind of like a change that the unions visioned or envisioned in a sense? There could be a reason that they do not want any change because small controls over management from the management, or more pressure from the technology, or whatsoever.
That's really interesting. I haven't actually thought of that. But some guys, and sorry, I meant to say it earlier. Through my presentation, I said guys because the union was like 99%.
Oh yeah,
male.
that's the nature of the trucking industry. Yes.
Yeah, and yeah, I can be more specific. This is the railroad industry that I worked with.
I
so
see.
Yeah, and a lot of it was, the technology stuff in terms of control didn't come up a lot, but kind of with respect to like, people, they were kind of worried about new technology in terms of like the machines that they used and stuff like that, as that being maybe a card that they could play to maybe if they advanced the technology enough, they could use workers who are trained on it that are not necessarily union. So I think there was some worry of that, like keeping the skills up as a way to suppress the union, because they did have a lot of issues with contractors, like union work being done by contractors. That was like one of the main things. So I could see that being a problem for sure.
Wonderful, thank you.
So we have a question on the chat from Jen Armour. So she's asking, I will be running a national union survey on their internal practices early next year. Do you have any tips, suggestions for me based on your experience? Has anyone an answer to that?
I will let other folks to first speak first.
I can think about it and send an email with my thoughts later, but nothing really offhand.
Are you talking about variables you should measure, or I'm not sure.
No, I'm not looking for variables. Like we have that stuff worked out.
Okay.
It sounds like some of you have drawn some conclusions about how they operate. Tingting's got a big smile on her face. If you'd had any experiences that you could share, and just general suggestions to how to engage with unions, really.
I will probably say, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question right, but I think the notion of voice, it's something like I worked on another paper with young members and also in different kind of occupation, and it's always something which come up, so like the notion of voice and being able to express themselves. It's kind of a big determinant or a big of engagement, involvement, getting to know the representative also. There's one results. Maybe Chris, you had something like that in your research, but we did a research on young members, and one big results we came up with, it was like a lot of young members, they don't know the representative, they don't know who is, where they can get their information. So it was kind of a really surprising result for us. So I don't know if there's, and also which is all practices about socialization at the first steps of like becoming a member. It's part. It also came out as a really important process in terms of like create mobilization and involvement at the end of the process, or feeling a sense of belonging with the union. I don't know if you want to add something, Chris, or.
Yeah, I found all that same stuff in exactly the same stuff. The young people felt they weren't, or yeah, they didn't really know what unions were for, how to get in touch with people, how to use the services that the union has, how to, all those types of things that should be done right from the outstart, or from the get-go, it seems like. But yeah, exact same things that you just mentioned.
So I'm afraid we're out of time. 1 minute left. That's not enough for questions. So I will just congratulate everyone for their paper. Great session. A lot of commonalities. So it was really interesting. So see you next time, guys, in person, I hope. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew, for organizing.